Welcome back to Ithaca BJJ. Today, we're going to talk about something that many of you white belts struggle with, and that is passing the guard. In fact, we're going to see a running theme here that most of you run into and how to fix it. Right there, we see Chris on the bottom is framing well. And the problem with Brandon is that he's way too high. He needs to get back, and he needs to wrap that head as he's coming around and control that near side hip. And without doing that, Chris is able to get that leg back inside In fact, look at the big gap there between them. This allows Chris to reestablish his guard. Here, notice how high Brandon's butt is. And he's practically looking between his legs. He has no idea what's going on in front of him. Now he has this leg here, which is a good start, but watch what happens. Chris is able to continue to reestablish his guard. And because there's so much distance between them, Brandon can't break through. Now here he has an opportunity to go around the back and establish guard on Chris's left side. But what does he do? Instead, he steps right between his legs. Now I like the back step there, but this is the way it should be done. Here, Jim has control of Professor Matt's head, his own head is close, and he has control of that leg. Here's another example. John has weaved through Professor Matt's legs, and his head is nice and close. Now look here. Look at all that space that's there. And here's a running theme, those frames. Brandon has to deal with Chris's hands. And look at that. Look how easily Chris gets his leg back inside. Now Brandon comes around to the other side, but again, the same theme, he has to deal with those hands. Folks, dealing with grips hands like that is very similar to dealing with grips. You can't just ignore them. And here it is again. There's that hand preventing Brandon's advance. Think of those hands, think of those frames as you would think of grips. You have to deal with dominant grips. And here it is again. As long as those hands are framing and keeping Brandon away, he will never advance past that guard. And there's that hand again. Now I love this back step, but again, look at all this space. Now he's almost there, but those arms are there. If he could just deal with those arms, he could get to the head and establish a decent side control. Here he should wrap that head and control this hip. But instead, watch this. Chris has so much freedom of movement, he almost fully reestablishes his guard. So here's Professor Matt talking about how to deal with some of these strong frames. You can't just ignore that arm. So he does a power move to get past that frame. Here's another example. Bam. And here he's going to use a chopping motion as he rotates around again to deal with those frames. Folks, you cannot ignore those strong frames. Here we see Jim on the bottom using his arms to get distance from Professor Matt. Now watch what Professor Matt does with Jim's arms. He traps that arm so that he can continue his advance and go for a submission. Here's another example of what to do. If you're having trouble with one side, folks, always remember, the body has two sides. You can move to the other side. So in this case, Professor Matt illustrates how to reverse this move and do a leg weave. Now watch here. Same thing. Are we seeing a pattern here? Look at those hands. Brandon will not advance if he does not deal with those hands. And this is something I see a lot of you white belts doing. And Chris, although he's doing a very good job defending, he's not really doing anything spectacular. He's merely keeping Brandon away with his arms. And because Brandon is ignoring those arms, he just cannot get past that guard, which leads to frustration, which then leads to more mistakes. And here it is again. Do you see it? The same pattern. You got to deal with those hands and those frames. There it is again. So remember, folks, if you're having difficulty getting past the guard, it's probably because number one, you're not dealing with grips, and number two, you're not dealing with frames. When someone extends their arms out like that, you need to break those frames and get them out of the way. Or, if you know a few, you can actually hit some submissions on those arms. Thanks again for watching, and remember to like and subscribe, and bust past that guard.